When a man truly loves, something profound transforms within him. And this transformation is not only emotional but psychic, archetypal, almost ancestral. He begins to see the beloved not as an ideal or projection, but as a real living presence that touches his depths and calls him to the responsibility of being whole. At this moment, moved by an invisible force, he begins to act in ways he himself does not fully understand. Carl Jung's analytical psychology helps us decipher these signs, revealing what lies behind the genuine attitudes of a man who loves consciously and in an integrated way. Prepare yourself to dive into hidden layers of male behavior and understand what really happens when love is more than desire, when it becomes a calling for the soul. Leave in the comments, "I am ready to recognize conscious love in my life." From Carl Jung's perspective, true love is not just a fleeting feeling or a romantic idealization. It is a transformative experience that calls the individual to confront his unconscious parts. When a man loves deeply, he inevitably encounters his own complexes, his shadows and his projections. And it is precisely in this confrontation that the authenticity of love resides. Jung described projection as the act of attributing to the other person our own unconscious qualities, often idealizing or demonizing whoever stands before us. At the beginning of a relationship, it is common for a man to project his anima, the feminine aspect of the psyche, onto his partner. She then becomes the bearer of his deepest ideals, a mirror of his soul. However, over time, if the love is real, he is compelled to withdraw these projections and to see the real person, imperfect, human, complex, and yet still continue to love. This process marks the beginning of individuation, the path of integration and wholeness. To love in this context demands that he commit to his own inner evolution, facing his shadow, those repressed and denied parts of himself, and seeking to balance the opposing poles of the psyche, the masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious. Therefore, when a man loves authentically, he doesn't just do things for the one he loves. He transforms. His actions begin to reflect this inner journey. He shows presence, real listening, emotional responsibility, and above all, courage to love with his soul, not merely with his ego. The process of individuation, according to Carl Jung, is the path by which an individual becomes who he truly is, integrating unconscious aspects of the psyche into consciousness in a deep journey of self-knowledge and authenticity. When a man truly loves, this feeling can function as a powerful catalyst for this process. Love pushes him sometimes abruptly into himself, demanding that he question old patterns, break through social masks, and face what is most essential in his being. Contrary to what popular culture suggests, love from the Jungian viewpoint is not simply an idealized state of enchantment or romance, but an archetypal force that destabilizes the ego and calls forth the self. When a man comes into deep contact with love, he finds himself confronted with parts of himself that were once dormant or repressed. This may manifest as emotional confusion, intense fears, inner resistance, but also as a drive for growth, to become better, to understand what he feels and why he feels it. This urge to understand and transform is the first sign that the process of individuation has been activated. Love functions as a mirror, making him aware of his own emotional limitations, his wounds, his defensive ways of relating. And by recognizing this, he is invited to dive deeper, seeking to integrate his vulnerabilities rather than hide them. It is common at this stage for a man to revisit his story, his references of masculinity, his beliefs about intimacy and surrender. Everything socially built as a model of manhood may begin to crumble. He realizes that to love truly has nothing to do with control, power, or possession, but with presence, listening, and willingness to bear himself emotionally. And this bearing is not only before the other, but before himself. Individuation also involves a realignment of priorities. The man being transformed by love stops seeking only external gratification and begins to question purpose, meaning, and authenticity. He longs to be truthful, not just pleasing. He wants to express himself wholly, not merely live up to what others expect of him. Love forces him out of the surface, into contact with his deepest desires, and into making choices that resonate with his essence. This path, however, is neither linear nor easy. Individuation is marked by crises, internal ruptures, moments of loneliness and confusion, but it is also crossed by clarity, expansion, and transformative encounters with himself. And when this process is propelled by love, it acquires an even more intense dimension, because the bond with the other becomes a sacred territory where the man can reveal himself and also heal. It is in this context that true love differs from superficial bonds. It is not comfortable all the time nor simple. On the contrary, it requires courage, maturity, and readiness to grow. To truly love implies entering a path with no return, the path of inner truth. And the man who accepts this calling is, even if unconsciously, walking the path of individuation. Love then becomes a spiritual, psychological, and existential journey. The beloved ceases to be an ideal and becomes a mirror partner, a companion on the journey. The man in turn ceases to be a mere reproducer of patterns and becomes a seeker, someone who desires to understand and integrate all his parts to love wholly. It is not about perfection, but about wholeness. This is the true impact of conscious love. It moves us inward, breaks us to rebuild us, challenges us to free us. And when a man loves with such readiness, he is taking the most important step of his psychic life. He is choosing to be whole. In Jung's analytical psychology, the anima represents the archetype of the feminine in a man's psyche. It is not an external woman, but an inner image, a personification of everything sensitive, receptive, intuitive, and emotional within him. When a man is unconscious of his anima, he tends to project it onto women in the external world, idealizing them, becoming frustrated with them, or relating to them unconsciously. But when this energy is recognized and integrated, the way he relates changes profoundly. Integrating the anima does not mean becoming less masculine, but more whole. A man who lives in denial of this psychic part acts rigidly, dominantly, or emotionally distant. He fears contact with his emotions and sees vulnerability as weakness. In love, this manifests as inability to surrender, need for control, or escape from real intimacy. He may confuse passion with possession, affection with dependence, presence with invasion. On the other hand, when he begins to connect with his anima, whether through dreams, self-knowledge, or profound experiences such as true love, something softens in his inner structure. He begins to value aspects he once ignored or despised: listening, empathy, connection, sensitivity, introspection. He no longer sees his partner as an extension of his needs or as someone to fill his voids. Instead, he begins to see her as another soul, complex and real, worthy of being understood, respected, and embraced. This recognition is liberating. The man who integrates his anima allows himself to feel, to cry, to make mistakes, and to learn. He becomes more authentic, less tied to stereotypes, and more emotionally available. This radically changes how he loves. He no longer seeks merely someone to complete his gaps, but someone with whom he can share his wholeness, even if imperfect. In the relational field, integrating the anima allows him to build more mature bonds. He no longer fears emotional chaos, the inevitable crises of a real relationship. He understands that love is not linear nor controllable, but can be deeply transformative when lived in truth. And this truth is only possible when he knows his own emotions, his limits, his traumas, and when he is willing to listen to the other with an open heart. One of the main signs that the anima is being integrated is the change in how a man reacts to conflict. Instead of fleeing or reacting with aggression, he seeks to understand. He no longer sees his partner as guilty for his feelings, but recognizes that there is always an internal reflection involved. This emotional self-responsibility is a key marker of mature love, and it is only possible when the energy of the anima is no longer repressed or projected, but conscious and available within him. Another relevant aspect is that, by integrating the anima, the man gains access to his creativity, his spirituality, and his intuition. These elements, often neglected in an excessively rational or ego-driven psyche, become part of his way of living and relating. He becomes more present, more attentive to details, more connected to what he feels and to what the other expresses. Love ceases to be only a physical or emotional experience and becomes a symbolic and sacred experience as well. It is important to understand that this integration does not happen automatically or passively. It requires inner work, confrontation of the shadow, recognition of unconscious patterns, and above all, willingness to open to the unknown within. The presence of a conscious woman who does not feed the projection but invites the man into contact with his own truth can be a crucial factor in this process. But in the end, the work is his with his own psyche. The man who truly loves and is willing to grow emotionally must make this move. Integrating the anima is what allows him to love without demanding, to give without losing himself, to commit without imprisoning himself. It is what turns love into a bridge, not a prison. It is what transforms the bond into growth, not into repetition of old wounds. When this inner encounter happens, love ceases to be a search for completeness and becomes an expression of totality. When a man loves consciously, his behaviors do not arise as strategies to conquer or keep someone by his side, but as natural reflections of an inner transformation. He does not love to fill a void, nor to escape from himself. He loves because he has found himself enough to recognize in the other a partner for the journey, and not a projection of his idealizations. This awareness radically changes his way of acting, making certain signs perceptible that go beyond words or promises. The first of these signs is real presence. Being present does not only mean being physically next to someone, but being emotionally accessible, mentally attentive, and spiritually available. The man who loves consciously values shared time, listens actively, responds with genuine interest, and shows that he is fully there. He is not running away. He does not emotionally withdraw. He does not avoid difficult conversations. On the contrary, he faces intimacy as an opportunity to go deeper, not as a threat. Another essential sign is coherence between words and actions. Conscious love does not allow dissonance between what is said and what is done. This man knows that promising is easy, but loving demands commitment to reality. He does not hide behind excuses, nor does he use pretty speeches to mask emotional absence. His behavior is stable, clear, and honest, even in the face of his own limitations. He does not promise perfection, but delivers truth, and that is infinitely more valuable. There is also a growing capacity for vulnerability. The man who is aware of what he feels and committed to love no longer sees vulnerability as weakness. He allows himself to be seen in his humanity, shares fears, doubts, wounds. He understands that real intimacy is born from the meeting of truths, not from performing an ideal image. This emotional surrender is not theatrical, but silent and powerful, because it comes from an inner place of maturity. Another revealing aspect is respect for his partner's cycles and individuality. Conscious love does not annul, does not suffocate, does not demand absolute emotional exclusivity. He understands that the other is an autonomous being, with her own processes, unique needs, and a journey that he does not own. This respect is shown in small but consistent attitudes: support for personal decisions, encouragement of individual growth, absence of possessive jealousy, freedom to express emotions without judgment. He does not want an extension of himself, but someone with whom he can grow side by side. Emotional self-responsibility is another unmistakable sign. A man who loves consciously knows that his feelings, reactions, and triggers are his responsibility. He does not blame the other for his discomfort, nor does he place on the relationship the weight of his personal frustrations. When conflict arises, he seeks dialogue and listening instead of manipulation or escape. He understands that to love is also to learn, and that often learning comes from confronting his own shadows. A less obvious but deeply revealing sign is the ability to admire without idealizing. To love consciously means to see the other clearly, accepting both light and shadow, without trying to mold her to an unattainable ideal. The conscious man admires his partner for who she is, not for the role she plays in his life. He values her freedom, her intelligence, her strength, and her sensitivity, and he does so without projecting onto her his anima or his needs. He truly sees her, and this seeing is the greatest gesture of love he can offer. Finally, there is a silent yet profound sign: constancy. In times when many act by impulse and relationships are discarded easily, the man who loves consciously stays. This does not mean blind attachment or absence of conflict, but commitment to the bond. He chooses to remain even when it is challenging, because he understands that love is a path, not a destination. And this path requires continuous presence, daily choices, and openness to what is to come. All these signs do not appear as external strategies, but as consequences of an inner movement. When a man loves consciously, he does not just feel, he acts in accordance with the depth of his transformation. And it is in this action that true love is revealed. Love that becomes gesture, presence, and conscious choice day after day. In the symbolic universe of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, the shadow represents all aspects of personality that were repressed, denied, or excluded from consciousness throughout life. These are traits, impulses, memories, and emotions that the ego could not or would not integrate, but which continue to operate autonomously in the unconscious. For the man who loves consciously, facing his own shadow is one of the greatest tests of emotional commitment, because it involves recognizing everything that could jeopardize the quality of the bond and the integrity of the relationship. Love, by its transformative nature, functions as a mirror that sharply reflects each person's shadow. When a man becomes deeply involved with someone, his inner defenses tend to fall. It is in this terrain of intimacy that insecurities, fears of abandonment, tendencies to control, old resentments, and even self-sabotaging behaviors he did not know he carried emerge. To love, then, becomes an inevitable confrontation with one's own limits, a calling to deal with what has been buried. In this context, the man who chooses to face his shadow demonstrates a high level of emotional responsibility. He does not run from situations that make him feel inadequate, nor does he project onto the other the blame for the conflicts that arise. On the contrary, he embraces discomfort as a sign of something that needs to be looked at within himself. Instead of reacting aggressively or withdrawing emotionally, he asks himself, "Why does this bother me so much? Where does this pain come from? What is this teaching me about myself?" This kind of questioning is neither simple nor comfortable. It requires courage to admit mistakes, humility to review attitudes, and maturity to transform. But this process, although difficult, is also liberating. As the man delves into his shadow, he begins to better understand his automatic reactions, recognizes unconscious patterns he repeated in past relationships, and develops a new way of positioning himself in love. He becomes more conscious, less reactive, and more present. One of the most important aspects of this confrontation is the ability to recognize anger, jealousy, insecurity, and neediness, not as enemies, but as legitimate parts of the psyche that need integration. When these emotions are denied, they find distorted ways to manifest through verbal attacks, punitive silences, emotional games, or sudden withdrawals. But when they are accepted and understood, they lose their destructive power and can be transformed into awareness and empathy. True emotional commitment does not demand perfection, but it does demand presence and constant effort to know oneself. The man who faces his shadow within the relationship is saying, with his actions, that he is willing to grow alongside his partner, even when it means recognizing that he is wrong, that he needs to change, that there are traits in himself that still scare him. This level of surrender is rare, but deeply true. Moreover, by integrating shadow aspects of his own personality, the man also becomes more capable of embracing his partner's shadow. He no longer demands of her emotional purity, linearity, or perfection. He understands that everyone carries contradictions and wounds, and that mature love is the one that sustains the other, even on difficult days. He learns to love not in spite of the shadow, but also because of it. For he understands that it is in this territory that the deepest and most authentic bonds are born. It is at this point that facing the shadow becomes proof of love, because there is no greater proof than being willing to transform oneself to be better for the other and for oneself. This commitment is not manifested only in major decisions, but in small everyday gestures, in how he responds to a criticism, in how he apologizes after a mistake, in how he commits to changing harmful behaviors. The man who faces the shadow not only transforms himself, he transforms the field of the relationship. He creates a safe, real space where love can flourish without hiding the truth. He knows that to love is, above all, to be willing to dive into oneself. And in doing so, he becomes a rare partner, one who is present not only for moments of light, but also for the plunges into darkness. This is the love that sustains, that heals, and that transforms. The love that does not fear the shadow, because it knows that only those who face it head-on are capable of loving with an awakened soul. Conscious love transforms. When a man truly loves, he does not look for someone to complete his gaps, but for a partner with whom he can share his wholeness. He dives into himself, faces his shadow, integrates his anima, and walks, and often without even realizing it, the deep path of individuation. Each gesture, each word, each silence of his carries a greater meaning, not as a strategy, but as a reflection of an authentic and courageous inner movement. This love is not immediate, nor always easy, but it is true. It is a love that does not deny conflicts, but uses them as a mirror to grow. That does not pretend perfection, but chooses integrity. And that above all honors the presence of the other as an opportunity for mutual evolution. If you have reached this point, it is because you know that the love that transforms begins within. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey with us. Watch the next video that is now on the screen. It delves even deeper into this conversation about bonds, consciousness, and the soul. And remember, to love with consciousness is the greatest gift we can offer to ourselves and to those we choose to walk beside.